So, welcome everyone in today's lesson. Good news, bad news kind of situation. Bad news, I'm not in the best mood today. This whole quarantine and uncertainty is really getting to me, so I might be a little bit spacey and distracted and overall lacking of energy. And I'm so sorry, I'm doing my best, but it's hard. I know, I'm sure that you feel this too. So, anyway. Good news is that we are reaching a part in the syllabus which I actually really enjoy overall. Of course, it would be so much better if I could be there with you and we could do it in person, but let's make the best out of a bad situation. Anyway, so the topic we are reaching is sexism in comics. As you can see in the syllabus, we are actually doing two classes on this topic. Next week, it's how women are represented in canon and how they are sexualized or not sexualized. What are the changes in the trends right now? And today, it's how women are part of the fandom, the superhero, the comics fandom, how they are represented, what are the assumptions about female fans, how they are treated. I tried to make it interesting for you guys. But anyway, so let's dive into this. So, as we have already discussed in class before, there is this stereotypical comic book reader who is older, meaning older than 18, white, heterosexual, and male. Out of these, of course, male is the most important. Male and heterosexual is the most important. And once you deviate from this stereotype, you became an outlier, and and I told you guys I'm going to be spacey today. So an outsider, somebody whose opinions might not matter as much, somebody who is kind of invisible to the business, to the executives in the companies. But let's dive into this. So what happens when you are a woman in comics? Of course, here once again we kind of have to uh, divide into two sections: what used to be and what is now. And by used to be, I mean the 80s, the 90s, the era from when we have the most stereotypes about comic book fans, and the era which was the most alienating for women. Trina Robbins, who is a historian, she sometimes refers to herself as a historian, by the way. She is a feminist and she is a comic book fan. She had this very important and very famous quote that is in your text that you had to read for today as well, that she refers to this circle kind of logic, that there are no female readers of comics because comics just humiliate women and objectify women, so there is no content for women to read, and there is no content for women to read because women don't read comics. So you see how this is a self-aggravating process, and this is really what happened basically. Comics, as we discussed about the modern age, especially, comics became even more objectifying towards women, more masculine, more violent throughout the history of comics. This is once again something that we are going to talk more in detail next week. So yeah, women were really sidelined in the comic book industry. It doesn't mean that there were no female comic book fans. There were a couple of them. There is actually a pretty good anthology of essays called Chicks Dig Comics. I actually have that one, but in Budapest, so I can show it to you. Anyway, it's full of testimonies and memoirs from women, many of those who are not only comic book fans, but who became comic book creators, writers, artists, and they tell the reader about how it was to be a comic book fan in the 80s, in the 90s, and one of them actually refers to herself as a former unicorn, meaning that when she first became a fan of comics, She, as a comic book fan, she was as rare as a unicorn. She was a mythical creature that everybody was looking for in the comic book fandom, but no one really believed that she existed. That's how an outsider female comic book fans used to be, basically. And this can be also traced in numbers. For example, it's a um, very widespread practice to have a letters column in comics. So basically, that's a page in the end of the issue where you have fan letters printed, and the editors, or more rarely the authors, answer to those messages. And even in female-led comics, so I mean Wonder Woman and the first Miss Marvel in the 70s, and even X-Men. X-Men is very popular amongst female readers because it does have strong female leads, even if they are pretty much sexualized and not really treated well most of the time. But there were eras throughout the history of X-Men when women really got to play their part. Anyway, if we look at the fan letters in these issues, which, for example, Carolyn Cocca did in her book Superwomen, she actually puts a great emphasis on studying the letters pages and internet forums and looking at how many men and how many women are writing. Anyway, so she found that for X-Men, between about 1980 and 2010, and in Wonder Woman in the 70s, for example, most of the letters were by men. And in the first Miss Marvel series, that is 77 till 79, it was more than half of the letter writers were men. When it was supposed to be a very radically feminist, it was badly done, but it was meant to be a radically feminist issue series anyway. And it's not just that there is no real content, that much content for women, but women's access to comics were limited. Once again, we are in the 80s, in the 90s, when you can basically only buy comics in stores, in physical stores, in so-called brick and mortar stores. And those places were very masculine and sometimes very unwelcoming to women. Once again, in this Chicks Dig Comics anthology, there are stories about, for example, this woman going into a comic book store and superhero comics being right next to Playboys, or fanboys basically masturbating in the store to these very sexualized images of women. And it's also that the attendants, the owners of these shops, very often didn't take women seriously. I mean, you go there as a woman and you're already in the wrong because you don't know everything and because you're a woman. And there were also these assumptions, for example, that women can't even understand comics. This is also something that is documented. It was an actual argument against women reading comics anyway. So they said that women don't get comics because they are not visual as men and they don't even enjoy porn. That was their actual argument, that women cannot enjoy comics because they don't enjoy porn, which is just stupid. Anyway, so yeah, that was an argument, and this all builds up to the idea that the whole comic book subculture was constructed to be male, where a woman doesn't really have a place to be. And as far as hard data and numbers go, up until about 10 years ago, the whole readership of comics was only 5 to 10% female. Now that is what was. Now let's see what is happening now, because women, surprise, surprise, spoiler alert, women do read comics. There's actually right now, women between 17 and 30 are the most dynamically growing demographic when it comes to reading comics. Once again, we don't really have hard data, but based on anecdotal evidence, looking at the attendance of Comic Cons, and when we ask the owners of comic book stores about their clientele, it turns out that there is an estimated 30-45% of female readership in comics. Of course, it's not the same in every area, because women tend to read more manga, for example. If we would look at the percentages of manga sales in the United States, that would be, I'm just guessing here, like 70% female. So there is a difference in different genres and traditions once again. And basically, women are getting more open about reading comics. This is also something that the text mentions, that women are kind of ashamed of reading comics. This is something that I'm going to go deeper into in a moment. I'm just checking my notes. I'm sorry, I'm checking my notes. But why there are more female readers? Just a little look into why we are having more and more female readers. So first of all, we have the superhero blockbuster. The superhero blockbuster that is there everywhere for everyone, easy to access. You technically cannot avoid it. The superhero blockbuster brought the superhero genre back into the mainstream. It's not really shameful to be it's not embarrassing to be into superheroes anymore. The new distribution methods, the digital distribution, the trade paperbacks, they are making comics more accessible to women once again. Even comic book stores are becoming less and less masculine and more welcoming towards women. Of course, I'm talking about the American situation. Here in Hungary, okay, I'm going to talk about my personal experiences at the end of this video. So yeah, women are more into comics now. More and more women are reading comics because it's more accessible, and because, once again, we come back to this circular logic, because there are women who are reading comics, there is content made for women. Also, this is something that we're going to talk about next week when we talk about how women are represented in comics nowadays. And what is really interesting, that this change of how women are viewed within the community, within the subculture, within the fandom, is this changes has happened rather fast in a span of a couple of years, and it actually can be traced pretty well throughout the Big Bang Theory. I know that the text also mentioned Big Bang Theory, but what is really, and I mean, you can think and say and anything you want about Big Bang Theory. I know that many people don't like it. I personally really like it. That you can trace how the perception of women changed in the fandom throughout the scenes that are set in the comic book store throughout the seasons. I actually put a list on your handout with links to YouTube videos, but let's just go through my list. So the first time you have a girl in the comic book store, in Stuart's comic book store, I'm assuming that everybody knows what Big Bang Theory is and who the main characters basically are. So just a bunch of nerd boys, and throughout time they all get girlfriends and wives and stuff. So anyway, the first time that Penny, the main female character, goes to the comic book store, it's in the 20th episode of season 2, which means that it was made in 2008, so 12 years ago. she goes into the store and basically life stops. Everybody just stopped. So the store is full of men. These very awkward, socially inept guys reading comics, and then she, the pretty blonde girl, steps into the store and life just stops, and everybody just lifts their eyes and stare at her. And the owner of the comic book store, Stuart, actually has to tell them to stop. This is season 2. In season 5, in episode 7, and my math is bad, so I'm not going to say when it came out. That's it, 2011, 12-ish, something like that. There is a scene when Leonard actually picks up a girl in the comic book store. Kind of picks up, so they start flirting and she gives him her number. And then she is treated as this aforementioned unicorn. She is that mystical geek girl every geek boy wants to meet and wants to date, but they're not sure that she exists. But she does, and when she leaves the scene, Stuart, the owner, actually goes up to Leonard and he's like, "Did you just pick up a girl in the comic book store? Because then I'm taking your photo and you're going up there on the wall of honor, because that's a big deal." So now we are accepting that there are nerd girls and geek girls and girls who are into comic books and superheroes, but they're still very rare. They are like treasures. Next season, season 6, episode 13. This is when the 3 main female characters, so Penny, Amy, and Bernadette, go to the store. And once again, life stops and everybody stares. And the guys there need to be taught not to stare, but they are there because they're actually interested in comics, buying comics for themselves, because they want to know more about comics so they could understand why the guys like comics so much. And they actually ask valid questions. They are taken seriously. They have an actual conversation about comics with the owner. So this shows that women are still a big deal in comic book stores, but they can be into comics and they can be accepted into the fandom when they want to be part of it. So there are no so-called gatekeepers. After that, in season 7, episode 13, once again episode 13, Bernadette actually goes into a comic book store on her own because she accidentally destroyed a comic of her husband, and she wants to replace it before he realizes. And when they actually go to the regular comic book store, and Stuart doesn't have that comic, so they go into another store as well. And Bernadette is taken seriously. No one makes a comment about her being a girl. She's being helped to find that comic, so gender becomes less and less important in the setting. Then in season 9, episode 14, this is when Raj basically picks up a girl in the comic book store. And she is not a unicorn anymore. No one makes comments about her being a girl and her being in the comic book store. She is just there browsing comics, just as the guys are doing, and she just gets into the conversation they are having. And it's not about her being a girl and her being in a store anymore. And finally, in the end of season 11, the store becomes more popular, Stuart's store, and he hires an assistant manager who is a woman, Denise, and she's a geek. She studies art in university, sequential art and illustration. She's a big geek. She speaks the same language as the guys. She has the same knowledge as Stuart in comics, and no one is really miffed about her gender. What matters that she's into comics. So that's what we have. Basically, in less than 10 years, we went from, oh my god, there is a girl in the comic book store, and that is like a miracle, to, yeah, we have a female assistant manager, and that's completely okay. She's just one of us. So that's how quickly this change happened, which I think is it's very interesting. Now I just wanna sorry. And I just wanna say a couple of words about what the essay that you had to read was actually about, and that is stigmatization. I put the definition of stigmatization on the handout, so I'm not going to go there what it is actually. I'm pretty sure that you can actually define it with your own words. But the point is, so reading comics is stigmatized in many, many ways. For one thing, of course, comics are seen as low entertainment, as low literature, as something that if you are like an accomplished person, a well-read, high-standing person, you're not reading comics. Comics is for stupid people. That would be the assumption. Of course, it's not true, but we have this stigma that smart people and polished people don't read comics. And there is the stigma that comics is for kids. So if you're an adult, you shouldn't read comics. And if you're an adult and women, that is actually a double or even a triple stigma, because you shouldn't read comics because it's low entertainment, you shouldn't read comics because you're an adult, and you shouldn't read comics because you're a woman. Of course, the stigma of reading comics is slowly disappearing, because comics and superhero narratives are re-entering the mainstream, as we have talked about. And so it's starting to become cool. I'm not saying it's actually hard to get into superhero comics, because the grand narrative is so complex and there are so many characters to learn and to understand how these internal relationships and internal rules work, that it's actually hard to get into comics and start reading comics when you don't know where to start. By the way, if any of you hasn't read comics yet, apart that one you had to read for this class, and you don't know where to start but you want to start, feel free to write to me. I can give you some pointers where to start, if you want. So that's open for you. I can help you get started if you're interested. That's all I wanted to say. So the stigma is disappearing, but it's still kind of there. Even though there are more content for women nowadays, it's still pretty much a male territory. Pretty much, it's kind of changing and it's kind of not. So, yeah, I told you I'm going to be spacey. And I want to talk a little bit about the actual treatment of female fans and what happens or happened when you, as a female, want to join the superhero fandom. And the thing is that the reception can be very positive and can be very negative. So today, if you want to join the superhero fandom as a woman, you might be welcomed with open arms, basically with help and with joy. A woman being into comics still might be elevated to a higher status because they are still seen as kind of unicorns who are sought after the geek boys because they see them as potential girlfriends and stuff. But that's a completely different social dynamic. So anyway, but it can be pretty negative. The welcome can be pretty negative. There are several ways. There is what I already mentioned, which is called gatekeeping, which is basically this idea that the fans who are already in the culture, they don't want you to get into. They use tactics to keep new people out by saying that you don't know enough. You are not a real fan. You are not a real geek because you don't know this. You don't know the exact canon. You don't know enough information. You haven't read this. You haven't read that. Um, you don't like the right things. This is also very useful technique in keeping people out. That's saying that you don't like the right things too. So, for example, if you read only like one or two character stories, like you, for example, if you read only Jessica Jones, that's okay. Jessica Jones is still pretty violent, so it's like okay for the male fans. Jessica Jones is cool. I mean, I'm not arguing with that. But for example, if you only read Squirrel Girl, or you only read Miles Morales, you are not reading the right stuff. It can happen. I'm not saying it always happens, but it can happen. I mean, try telling fans that you hate Batman. Try telling. I actually hate Batman. I told you that. So try telling superhero fans that you hate Batman. Batman is like the god of comics, of comic book characters. So that is something that keeps outsiders out, newcomers out. Not knowing enough information, not liking the right stuff, not having read the important works. This is all gatekeeping. And the fear of being judged for your reading habits and for what characters you like. This can also be something that keeps newcomers, not only women but anybody, from openly admitting of liking comics or just trying to be an active part of fandom. This fear of being judged. There is also this stuff that we can actually analyze and see that there are different tendencies of fandom participation when it comes to men and women. I'm not saying that these are universal trends, but they are trends nonetheless. The point is that male fans tend to be curative. This means that for them, the fandom participation, the main part of fandom participation, is collecting and categorizing canonical data. Uh, what happens in one issue, who fought whom, what kind of powers they have, and this is how you end up with these very stereotypical arguments of who would win, Superman or Batman? Which is the cooler spaceship, the Millennium Falcon or the Enterprise? And they actually get into these kind of arguments. And if you don't have enough canonical information that you can use as a basis for your argument, you might be pushed out of the situation and of the fandom. Women, on the other hand, tend to lean towards creative fandom experience or transformative fandom experience. This means writing fanfics, creating fan art, um, coming up with creative scenarios for the characters, cosplaying. It's not exclusively a female thing, but there are still more female cosplayers than male ones. I would say, at least as uh, in Hungarian conventions, I would say there is one male cosplayer to every two or three female cosplayers. That's the difference about. And there is also kind of part of the gatekeeping that many male fans are still insisting the sexualized and objectifying representation of women. I've actually seen adult men, and not just fans but creators as well, throwing hissy fits because they are told that, okay, maybe you shouldn't draw women in a way that completely defies anatomy and that is super objectifying, that you can even see her butthole. I'm not exaggerating. There are drawings where you can basically see her butthole even though she is dressed. She has it's just a Spider Woman art, by the way. I can look it up for you if you want. So they say that if they are not allowed to draw this kind of stuff, that they are being oppressed. And just like, for example, see these very bad kind of femboys, these very radical and sexist fanboys losing their shit, their literal shit, when a character is not as objectified and sexualized as they want them to be. Look at them, how they're losing their shit in the case of the Birds of Prey or Captain Marvel. So it's kind of funny and sad in a way. And finally, I just wanted to. Okay, it's getting kind of dark, but I have no lights. Anyway, so as a closing point, I just wanted to tell you about some of my personal experience as a woman, and a very feminine and girly woman in the superhero fandom, in the comic book fandom, what I have experienced. Uh, there were mostly positive experiences on my part and some negative. Um, I haven't actually met active resistance and active hostility, at least in Hungary, but I've met some unconscious bias. For example, a couple of years ago, I attended a New Year's party, a superhero themed New Year's party at one of the gig bars in Budapest, and not long before midnight there was this Marvel quiz with 4 prizes and stuff, and it was done on Kahoot, so you could already as soon as everybody answered the question, you could already see the leaderboard and you already saw who won, and I won by a landslide, and I'm not joking, it was by a landslide. So I mean, it was a landslide, whatever. And there was this guy sitting next to me, and he came second. He had way less points than I did, but he came second. And when we finished, he actually said to me, he turned to me and he said, with not real bad intentions, that it was something that he actually believed in. Anyway, he said that I only won because he misclicked on a couple of questions accidentally. So he had this unconscious bias that I, as a woman, couldn't have known as much Marvel trivia as he did. So yeah, because I'm a girl. As for events in Hungary, there are comic book markets, Képregény Börse. It's like an occupational hazard. So when I go to these places, I always look for women and content for women, and I would say that it's still like one female reader to every 7 or 8 men. So here in Hungary, we are still pretty much underrepresented, I would say. But at the same time, when I teach my other class on women in comics, it's usually twice as many people trying to get into the class than there are places in the class, which tells me that there is a demand and there is an interest for the superhero narratives and for reading comics amongst women. Um, it's just hard to get into, I guess. Um, and also beyond the university realm, I often do presentations in different geek events in Hungary, in Budapest, especially like MondoCon. Oh my god, it's so painful right now because I was slated to do appearances at a bunch of places this spring, which all have been, of course, cancelled. But I was supposed to speak at the Spring MondoCon. I was supposed to speak at the Comic Book Festival in May. I'm still supposed to speak in July in MondoCon. I'm supposed to speak in August in Budapest Comic Con. I do smaller events. I've ever even been invited to speak in a library about comics. So yeah, that's what I do. And I remember the first time I did an event like this, and it was a small geek like Club Beste, and I talked about the different comic book eras, and that event was like 90% male. And I remember when I finished and the event itself was officially over, and I was just standing there, and I was literally surrounded by these very stereotypical geek guys. They were standing around me in such a tight circle that I could barely breathe, but I was this so-called unicorn for them. This geek girl who is into comics and who knows her stuff, and they were just so overwhelmed by the situation that in a way each one of them wanted to have a piece of me. And we had this long conversation, and they all had, okay, and what is your opinion of this one, and what is your opinion on that one, and what do you think of, and they were really enthusiastic about it, kind of. And but thinking about it, I think I was kind of lucky in a way, because I wasn't like going there with the intention of getting into the fandom. I wasn't there to ask for initiation. I went there and I already knew my stuff. I knew what I wanted to say. I already presented myself as an expert, and maybe that is why I didn't met any kind of resistance. That was actually a couple of years ago. So yeah, so I think I was kind of lucky in a way. And like finally, what I wanted to say you, what I wanted to tell you. So we don't really have comic book stores here yet in Hungary. Stores that actually sell these monthly single issue comics. But I spent a week in Ireland last summer, and I went to several comic book stores in Dublin, and I had very different experiences in those stores. So the first one I went to was Forbidden City. Forbidden City is like a big deal in European comic book distribution. It was a huge store right next to the river, very easily spotted. I remember I was there in July, so after Pride Month, but there were still a bunch of Pride flags everywhere, and the store had this Imperial Guard, you know, from Star Wars, the red, the guys in the red uniform. There was this statue of an Imperial Guard in the window, and even he had a pride flag and stuff like that. And anyway, so I went to that store, and it's actually a huge place, but it's not even that much about comics. So they would have the new issues on display and some sorry, I'm losing my voice. Some rare variant covers from other issues, and they had a bunch of trade paperbacks and omnibuses, but those only made up about a quarter of the store. It was two levels, and they had a bunch of Funko Pop figurines and different action figurines and statuettes and other merchandise. And I was so hyped about going there, and I was so much looking forward to going there. And it was kind of a letdown because they didn't have much of back issues, and the staff was so aloof, the most aloof stuff I've ever met. So I went there, and they literally didn't care. They literally didn't care that I was there. I don't think that it was because I was a woman. It was just they didn't care in general. The store was actually robbed when I was there, right in front of my eyes. And the manager like didn't even blink. So what happened basically that you had the counter right next to the front door, and I would say that I was standing in line at the counter, but there was no people in front of me actually, but the manager was on the phone, so he wasn't ringing me up at all. He was just making me wait. He was on the phone, and there was this collection box on the corner of the counter. They were collecting money, I think, for animal rescue or something like that. They had this collection box on the counter, and just as I was about to pay, a guy ran in the door, grabbed the collection box, and ran out. And he even knocked off some of the stuff from the counter. And the manager, he didn't even blink. He just picked up the phone again, called somebody, told him what happened, and he didn't even try to get the guy or anything like that. So um, Forbidden City was kind of a letdown for me because of that. I actually spent 2 days in Dublin, and that was my first day. When I first went to Dublin, I went to the Forbidden Planet, and the next time I went to Sub City. They actually have two Sub City stores. They are smaller, less well known, and more about the comics themselves. So they had so much bigger back issue catalog, and when I got to the first one, it was just opening. I was actually the first customer of the day, and the guy there, he was like 50ish, very very stereotypical Irish. He was speaking with such an accent that I could barely understand him, and he was really nice, really helpful. He started a conversation with me right away. I told him how hard it is to actually collect single issue comics in Hungary, uh, and especially because the shipping costs are so high. And he was instantly like that, okay, maybe I could help you. We can keep in touch throughout the internet. You can tell me what issues you want. Like, there is this thing that they call a pull list that they do in the US. Basically, the stores have a personal file for you, and they know what basically it's like a subscription, but you pick your stuff up in the store. So we could keep in touch. He could order the stuff that I wanted, and he could just ship them to me to Hungary. But I told him that, yeah, the problem is the shipping costs. So yeah, I actually didn't strike up a deal with him. But I just wanted to point out how helpful it was, how great the store was. I actually bought some stuff there, some back issues. Um, so I really enjoyed Sub City more than I did Forbidden Planet. But I enjoyed the Disney store the most, but that's a different story. I went to the Disney store and unfortunately they had a sale. So I don't want to think about how much money I spent in the Disney store in Dublin. Let's not talk about that. Um, I'm fine. Okay, and yeah, your weekly task. This is something that I had my previous group do as well, but they had to do the week before this class. That I want you. So if you're a girl and if you are in the community, I just want you to think about how you have been accepted, how have you been welcomed into this community, or if you are not. I want you to try to talk to friends who are geeks. How, if they are women, how did, what kind of experiences did they have as female geeks? If they are guys, how do they see female geeks? How they receive in the community? How they receive women in the community? So just let's try to make a bank, a collection of experiences of what is it to be a geek, a nerd, a superhero fan in Hungary today, in a reflection of gender. So basically, that's what I wanted to say. Um, there is one more note on my handout, and it's more like a way to start a conversation, because this is something that really excites me and really interests me. That uh, it's actually something that the text also mentions, this geek masculinity, how masculinity is constructed and performed in relation to being a nerd, in connection to being a comic book fan and being a superhero fan. But we don't really talk about female, geek femininity, because I think that's also a thing. But can you perform it? How does performativity play into this? Because performativity, a big part of performativity is the visuals, how you dress, how you look like. And I think it's actually harder to perform this fandom if you are a woman, because there is just a lack of merchandise, lack of options, and because the whole fandom is still constructed as masculine. How can you be a geek and feminine at the same time? What are your options? Can it be even done? Once again, I told you I am a very feminine person, like sometimes ridiculously feminine, and at the same time I love sci-fi and I love comics, which are still kind of viewed as masculine realms. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm not expecting you to answer it. It's just something basically for myself. Somewhere I want to take my research in the future. So basically that's what I wanted to say. This video has actually run a little long. I told you guys I really love this topic. So anyway, I'm going to stop this, and I'm looking forward to your comments and notes, and take care and bye.